This video is sponsored by Connell Guides. To get your hands on the most intelligent study guides on the market for GCSE and A-level English literature, as well as GCSE and A-level history, visit connellguides.com and use code RS15 at checkout for 15% off your order.
What are 10 top facts about the Shakespearean stage that you really need to know? Well, let's find out.
How's it going, Revision Squad? It's me, Liam, aka Mr. Knight, aka DystopiaJunkie, and in this video I'm going to give you my top 10 facts about the Shakespearean stage. Now, of course, the term Shakespearean stage is a little bit misleading. When we talk about the Shakespearean stage, what we really mean is the state of theatre in the late Elizabethan and early Jacobean eras, the times in which our good friend William Shakespeare was living and writing his plays. Anyway, knowing more about the theatres Shakespeare used as he put on his plays and the conditions that determined the writing of his plays should assist you in understanding those very same plays. It might help you to understand how and why Shakespeare included certain stage directions, how and why his audience might have reacted to his plays in certain ways, or how and why some of Shakespeare's language choices are in fact clever puns or jokes. All of this, I hope, will help you out as you study any of Shakespeare's plays, whether that's Romeo and Juliet, Midsummer, The Tempest, Much Ado, The Merchant of Venice, Macbeth, and so on. If this video does help you out, you can let me know by giving it a like, writing me a comment, sharing the video, and of course subscribing to my channel if you are not already. Your support is greatly appreciated, so thank you so much for all of that lovely stuff in advance. Okay, so first of all, some basic facts about the Shakespearean stage. These facts I'm going to give you for free. I won't be counting them toward my list of 10. Now, when we talk about the Shakespearean stage, we're actually talking about 3 different theatres. The very imaginatively named Shoreditch-based The Theatre, which Shakespeare's playing company used between 1594 and 1597. The Curtain Theatre, also based in Shoreditch, which they used between 1597 and 1599. And, most famously, the Globe Theatre, based in Southwark, between 1599 and 1613. It then burned down, but they rebuilt it, and Shakespeare and co. continued to put on plays there for about another year or so. These theatres bore a number of similarities. They were all polygonal in shape, which gave them an almost circular appearance. Now, we will be talking about the Globe Theatre for most of this video, seeing as it is the theatre Shakespeare used for most of his career. Now, the Globe was made of wood and had a thatched roof. At the Globe, the poor, also known as groundlings, could pay a penny and stand in the pit and watch performances. There was seating at the Globe too, but it was much more expensive. Alright, so those are some basic facts about the Shakespearean stage, but they did not make my top 10 list. So which facts did? Well, it's time to find out. Okay, so our first fact relates to the structure of the Shakespearean stage. The Globe, Curtain, and Theatre all had what is known as a thrust stage. This means that the stage stuck out into the audience's space and that they could look at the stage from 3 different sides. One reason why I think that this is important is that it could have made watching the play feel a bit more immersive, as its events feel more 3-dimensional than you might otherwise experience from a more traditional stage that is completely set back from the audience. However, this is also important as the stage's greater depth meant that the actors had more space to move into for asides and soliloquies. By being able to separate themselves from the main part of the stage where all of the action was taking place and move closer towards the audience, Shakespearean actors would have been more able to clearly demonstrate when their dialogue was not intended for their fellow characters to hear. Now, the next thing that you might notice is that the Shakespearean stage was actually quite bare. Now, this is a strange thing for me to comment on, I know. But if the stage was so minimal, how did Shakespeare capture his audience's imagination and have them believe that his plays were taking part in magical forests, great castles, or epic battlefields? One way he achieved this was through his language choices. If Shakespeare's characters ever explicitly mention the settings they are within, that isn't because the characters are having a lovely old natter about their surroundings. No, those comments are instead for the benefit of Shakespeare's audience. Now, on this idea, it is also important to know that big, heavy props were not necessarily used on stage. Given that the Shakespearean stage was a thrust stage, stagehands were less able to take large props on and off the stage as they probably would have been seen by the audience. However, big, heavy props may have been used in the discovery space. Behind the big middle doors at the back of the stage was another space. Now, this was often used by actors to get changed and was sometimes used to store props and whatnot, but occasionally it was also used as part of the performance itself. Think about all those scenes from Shakespeare's plays where a large prop is mentioned, one that is far too large to suddenly be dragged onto stage, like Juliet's tomb, Othello and Desdemona's bed, and so on. This is where the discovery space might have been used. This way, Shakespeare was able to have his cake and eat it. Rather than have his audience see large props be dragged on and off the stage, which would have decreased tension, he was able instead to get his fellow players to move large props around behind the stage and then dramatically reveal those at the desired moment. Very clever, Will. Very clever. Alright, so the next fact about the Shakespearean stage that I think you need to know is that it had a balcony. Now, many key scenes throughout Shakespeare's dramatic oeuvre depend on the theatres he used having balconies. Romeo and Juliet's balcony scene is of course a key example of this, but you should also know that Shakespeare often placed musical performers up on the balcony too. Now, a final thing I want you to consider. Do height differences relate to power levels and power imbalances? If a character is placed in a position of greater verticality on the stage, that tends to suggest that they are more powerful. So perhaps Iago watches Othello from above, or maybe Prospero observes Miranda and Ferdinand from up on the balcony. It's something worth keeping in mind, especially if you want to demonstrate to your teachers and your markers that you are showing an awareness of the form of these plays. Next up, let's think about trapdoors, because the Shakespearean stage had two. At the Globe, they had a trapdoor coming from a part of the stage named the Heavens, and one that led to a part of the stage called Hell. So, the Heavens was the name of the ceiling above the stage. This space was beautifully decorated with pictures representing the zodiac, sun and moon, and the Roman gods Apollo and Mercury. Apollo was the Roman god of music, poetry, and the arts, and Mercury was the god of trade, profit, and commerce. And so by having both of these gods on the ceiling represents the fact that theatre was a form of popular entertainment. It was art, yeah, but it was also produced for financial gain. Furthermore, actors on ropes and wires could ascend into or descend from the heavens in Shakespeare's plays. Think about Ariel in The Tempest or Puck in Midsummer, for example, and how this trapdoor would allow their otherworldly characteristics to be captured on the stage. On the other hand, Hell was the name of the space underneath the stage. Actors could access it or the stage via a trapdoor on the floor of the stage. Now this could have been used for more dark and supernatural characters in Shakespeare's plays, such as the witches in Macbeth. Now this space had some other uses too, but we will talk about those a little later on in this video. One final fact about the structure of the Shakespearean stage is that the Globe, Curtain Theatre and the Theatre were all open-air theatres, which means that they were completely exposed to the elements. Although the stage and the seated areas had thatched roofs, the pit was completely uncovered, and so people could get rained on if the weather wasn't great. Now this is interesting, as the natural light was both a benefit and a hindrance to the performances. Obviously there wasn't any electricity back in Shakespeare's day, and so they didn't have electrical lighting, meaning that the sunlight made the performances visible. Great! However, if Shakespeare and co were relying on sunlight for their performances, it made presenting nighttime scenes all the more difficult. Just how did Shakespeare convincingly create the impression that parts of his plays, like the scene in Macbeth in which Banquo is murdered, took place in the dark? We'll discuss that a little bit later on in this video. So now let's think about something other than the structure of the Shakespearean stage. For example, did it have music and sound effects? The answer is yes. People playing instruments often appeared on stage, almost as if they were characters in the play. Because the music being played existed both inside the story world and in real life, it is what is known as diegetic sound. There's loads of references to musicians in Romeo and Juliet, especially in and around the Capulet household, and people playing trumpets and drums often mark royal characters entering or exiting the scene in Shakespeare. I mean, just look at the stage directions. If you see the word flourish, that means that trumpets and drums are supposed to be playing to mark those arrivals and exits. Now, the space known as Hell was also useful when it came to sound effects and music. Typically, strange or unsettling sound effects like spooky wailing, people making animal cries, or the rattling of chains would originate from this space. Likewise, the heavens house a cannon. Now this cannon was used during battlefield scenes to recreate the sound of fighting, and was also used to recreate the sound of thunder. Interestingly, it was because of this cannon that the original Globe Theatre burned down. It misfired during a performance of Henry VIII and set the wooden beams and thatching alight, and the whole theatre quickly went up in flames. Oh dear. Moving on, I think it is important for us to consider who was allowed to perform on stage in Shakespeare's time. Back then, only men were allowed to perform on stage. There were very rigid gender roles in Elizabethan and Jacobean England, or at least certainly when Shakespeare was writing his plays. Women were generally treated as the property of their husbands or fathers, and they were usually expected to deal with the domestic space, looking after the home, cooking and cleaning, raising children, and so on. The stage was considered a dangerous place for women to be, as it was thought that it would distract them from these duties that they were expected to fulfill, and it was believed that women would fall into temptations such as sex, drink, and other substances if they were allowed to perform. As a consequence, women were prevented from being allowed to perform on stage in Shakespeare's time. As a consequence, men had to play the female roles. Generally, prepubescent boys played girls because their bodies were less developed, their voices had not broken, and they did not have any facial hair. On the other hand, older men tended to play older female characters. Shakespeare's use of language does in fact reflect this theatrical convention. The word beard is actually quite a loaded and complex term in Shakespeare's time, as it had many different meanings and connotations. But there are times where it can be seen as acknowledging the fact that female characters were played by men. For example, Look at how Banquo states that the witches have beards in Macbeth. It's clearly Shakespeare having a joke about the witches being played by men. Shakespeare likes to play around with this convention, and so there are points in his plays where female characters sometimes dress up as men. As a result of that, Shakespeare's audience would be watching a male actor play a female character who is then pretending to be a male character. This back and forth occurs in plays like The Merchant of Venice and As You Like It, and allowed female characters to temporarily experience an increased status in society that afforded them extra privileges, or fewer restrictions at the very least. Whilst thinking about the actors on the Shakespearean stage, it might be worth asking, did they have costumes and props? The answer is yes. Costumes were used to indicate a character's age, social status, gender, and so on. This meant that Shakespeare could more convincingly portray his female characters on the stage. Interestingly, there were laws in Elizabethan England that made it illegal for people to wear clothes that did not befit their social status. Poor people were forbidden from dressing up like nobles, basically. However, these laws did not apply to people taking part in performances, and so the use of costume in the theatre was a sort of escapism from reality, you could argue. Now, these costumes were often quite expensive. Shakespeare and his company often had particular garments commissioned for certain characters or roles. To get more value for money, some costumes might be reused or adapted for different productions. In fact, to reuse the same clothes across different productions, Shakespeare and his fellow players would have used small props to further indicate a character's identity. Crowns for royalty, swords for soldiers, warriors or noblemen, daggers for assassins, and so on. These props would have generally been fairly cheap too, certainly when compared with the really expensive costumes. Last of all, these props would also help to establish a scene's setting. Now, this is particularly clear in nighttime scenes. As I mentioned earlier, Shakespeare's performances took place during the day, and so something had to be done in order to make it clear that the story was taking place at night. Props such as torches and lanterns, light sources that people would have used in the dark in Shakespeare's time, could be carried by characters to show that it was nighttime and that they otherwise would not have been able to see. Look at all of the nighttime scenes in Macbeth and how many times a torch or a lantern is mentioned. Moving on, who owned the playing companies? Well, Shakespeare and his fellow actors more or less owned their own playing company. Not only did they act in the performances and write their own material, but they would have been responsible for dealing with a lot of the business administration side of things as well. However, patronage from a noble was both beneficial and almost essential in Shakespeare's time. Patronage is a term that in this case means support from someone of higher status or authority, and in Shakespeare's time, nobles would support playing companies financially, but would also give them a sort of seal of approval that gave them a better reputation. Without this patronage, playing companies would have been considered masterless men, vagabonds who would have been treated fairly harshly wherever they went. Now, Shakespeare's playing company went by many names over its history, depending on who their patron was. But in 1603, they became known as the King's Men, because King James I of England became their patron. This fact makes me wonder, however, given the royal patronage he received, did Shakespeare alter the content of his new plays? After all, Macbeth, a play about kingship, Scotland, and the supernatural, was written shortly after Shakespeare received patronage from a Scottish king who was into the supernatural. The final factoid that I would like to share with you relates to censorship. Was Shakespeare allowed to write about whatever he wanted in his plays? The answer is surprisingly no. During Shakespeare's time, a political figure known as the Master of Revels became responsible for stage censorship. They had to approve of the content of plays before they were allowed to be put on. Most relevantly to Shakespeare, the Master of Revels prevented Shakespeare from explicitly naming any living person in his plays. I wonder if this is a reason why Shakespeare often set his plays in far-off lands or in different times to his own. Not just so that he could avoid getting his plays censored or banned because, he's not writing about anyone who's actually alive in England, but because by setting them somewhere else, it made it easier for him to make indirect and maybe sometimes snarky comments about people, politicians, or other authority figures that he had encountered. Now, despite the censorship that Shakespeare faced, he actually did manage to name some living people in his plays. This is most evident in King Lear, which begins with characters discussing whether the Duke of Cornwall or the Duke of Albany would succeed the current king, or if the king would split his kingdom in two. Now, to us, these sound like random, arbitrary titles, but they were actually the very same titles that King James had given his sons, and Shakespeare's audience would have been very familiar with that fact. This makes me wonder if Shakespeare had received special royal approval to explicitly name these people and present the disunion of the kingdom as a bad thing, which would make his play almost propagandistic, as King James I desired a single united kingdom. Knowing that Shakespeare's plays weren't just art or entertainment, but that they also had a slight propagandistic element to them, given their patronage, certainly makes me consider their content in a different light. Alright, so those are my top 10 facts about the Shakespearean stage complete. We've discussed the physical architecture of the theatres Shakespeare used and how this may have influenced how and what he wrote. We have thought about sound and special effects, props, costumes, and who was allowed to perform on stage. We've even considered the playing company's patronage, the potential threat of censorship, and how these may have informed Shakespeare's writerly choices. Hopefully, the facts discussed in this video have helped you to understand the conditions of Shakespeare's plays a little better, and have sparked off some interesting analytical ideas in your mind about the Shakespeare play or plays that you are studying. If this video has helped you out in any way, you can let me know by giving it a like, writing me a comment to let me know, subscribing to my channel if you aren't already, and of course sharing this video with anybody else who you think might find it useful. All of that lovely stuff helps me out absolutely loads, and I do really appreciate it. Anyway, thank you once again for watching this video, and thanks also to the wonderful people over at Cornwall Guides for sponsoring it. Remember to check out their revision guides and use code RS15 for a discount at checkout. Remember too, as always, that I hope that you have an awesome rest of the day. And if you are revising, please do take frequent short breaks, as a burned out student is not a happy or successful student, which is what I think you deserve to be.
Okay, so those were 10 top facts about the Shakespearean stage that I think you really ought to know. But which fact do you think is the most useful? Or do you have a different fact that you think is more deserving of going into my top 10 list? Either way, you can let me know down in the comment section below. Cheers.